While the bombing of Gaza continues without the pause requested by governments around the world, politics has spilled onto the streets. But in this war, it is not so much the Arab street that is up in arms at Israel, but the street in Europe and the US, where there are ever louder demands to stop bombing Palestinian civilians. There have been demonstrations in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as well, combining demands for more action to free the 242 hostages in Gaza with demands on the embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to step down. And America's senior diplomat has been meeting Arab foreign ministers in Jordan to try and stop Israel's growing isolation in the region. Well, Israel's military says it is continuing to push forward with its offensive against Hamas, which the UK has designated as a terrorist organization. It claims it has now completely encircled Gaza City and the north of the enclave. Simeon Brown has all the latest.
At the Al-Fakura school, the classes have paused, but the lessons of war continue. Today, this child learnt how to lift a decapitated body. This young boy says he was stood here when 3 bombs landed, and he helped to move those who did not survive. No child should have to carry the dead, yet alone live expecting to join them. Since the conflict, this UN-run school in Jabalia has been a shelter for the displaced, but it has not been able to keep anyone safe from Israel's bombardment. This man is asking, when has it been normal to bomb refugee camps? Where is the United Nations? This is unfair, he says. This is the aftermath. Earlier this week, the US asked Israel to explain a strike on the Jabalia refugee camp that the UN said could be a war crime. The disputed death toll is between dozens and hundreds. In northern Gaza, the Israeli offensive has increased. There has been another strike outside the Al-Quds hospital. It is now home to 14,000 people. This picture is from the Palestinian Red Crescent. The Israeli Defense Force is yet to confirm, but they are on the ground in northern Gaza, as seen in their videos. Those displaced from this part of Gaza had been told to move south and the main road would be safe to use for 3 hours today. But among displaced Palestinians, there was little trust Israel would keep its word. If there is hope for a diplomatic solution, US Secretary Antony Blinken is in Jordan, where there is an absence of consensus with these Arab leaders.
We are still asking for an immediate ceasefire and for Israel to stop hindering the delivery of humanitarian aid. We are also demanding an international investigation into this violation of international law.
It's our view that a ceasefire now would simply leave Hamas in place, able to regroup and repeat what it did on October 7th. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just a few days ago, a senior Hamas official said that it was their intent to do October 7th again and again and again.
So where next for this conflict? Israel currently rejects a ceasefire whilst Hamas remain in Gaza with Israeli hostages. Yet the US now supports a brief humanitarian pause and is preparing the ground for when the fighting ends. Yet nobody can see just how or when that will be.
Simeon Brown reporting. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is with me now again. It's good to see you again, Lindsay. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been a very busy man. He's back in Jordan today meeting all these Arab foreign ministers, as we just said. What's he trying to achieve and what will he achieve?
Well, his version of events is slightly different from their version of events, I would say. What he said earlier today was that the Arab leaders agreed with the Americans that Hamas may not, must not rule Gaza again in the future. But we haven't heard them say that. And in fact, the Jordanian foreign minister was railing against the Israelis in very strong language for what he called war crimes and saying that this must stop and there must be a ceasefire immediately. And of course, the Americans don't want a ceasefire immediately. They say that there should be humanitarian pauses, 3 to 12 hours to allow aid. But they haven't got those yet, have they? They haven't had anything like that. And then at the same time, you've got another complication in Gaza, which is Hamas apparently, according to the Egyptians and the Americans, stopping both the wounded and foreigners from leaving, because they were apparently trying to get wounded Hamas fighters out, and that wasn't supposedly part of the plan. So you have that disagreement there.
So we're going to talk about the demonstrations in Europe and the US later in the program. There have been very few demonstrations on Arab streets as we would have expected in the past. I mean, there have been a few. What's going on there?
Well, there have been some. I mean, there was one in Jordan yesterday, and
but
not in the Arab,
small compared to what they used to have.
Yeah, relatively small. But also the countries where you would have expected those demonstrations, Syria, Iraq, and so on, are not the countries that have power in the Middle East anymore. The countries with power are the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and nobody demonstrates on the streets there because you're not allowed to.
And also it's about money there, isn't it? And investment in Israel and all these other things.
Absolutely. And also people there are not politically engaged in the same way. In the Gulf, they've never been as politically engaged as they are in the Levant. But it's those countries in the Gulf, particularly the UAE, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which will be the ones who decide what will happen in Gaza afterwards. They're the ones with the money. They are the ones with the political clout. And they are the ones which have some kind of relationship with Israel. So they are going to become ever more important.
Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now is national security expert and former Middle East advisor at the Pentagon, Jasmine Al Gamal. Thank you so much for coming on the program, Jasmine. Do you think that diplomacy, especially American diplomacy, is working at the moment, or is it failing?
Unfortunately, Secretary Blinken has very little to show at this moment in time for the shuttle diplomacy that he's been conducting over the last 4 weeks. As you mentioned, protests around the world are getting louder and more urgent, calling for a ceasefire, for a humanitarian pause to let humanitarian assistance in. Secretary Blinken and President Biden's own party members are now asking urgently for a humanitarian pause. You have around 60 members, Democratic members of Congress, both congressmen and women and senators, who have written to Secretary Blinken to ask him to push harder for a humanitarian pause. And Secretary Blinken himself has said that he's been having these conversations with the Israelis, unfortunately to no avail at this point.
Why do you think that is? I mean, it always puzzles me why the Americans, who spend so much money and send so many weapons to Israel, don't have more clout in these very perilous times.
You know, I mean, that's a great point. It's a great question. I mean, one of the sort of primary reasons that the U.S. administration, successive U.S. administrations have stated that the reason they are so publicly supportive of Israel, they call it this bear hug diplomacy, unequivocal, unwavering support for Israel in public, is precisely because they think that that should give them more leverage behind the scenes to push for things like a humanitarian pause that is so needed right now. And you see that that's not happening. I think it tells you something about what the Israeli government and what Israeli officials are feeling right now in terms of pressure to come up with some sort of result that Prime Minister Netanyahu can hold up to his people and say, look, I know I messed up on October 7th. I know I was to blame. I know you're angry, but look, here's what we've done. And I think that is what's driving them to ignore American requests at the moment and up until now.
I mean, the question that we keep coming back to, like a tongue to an aching tooth, is what on earth happens with Gaza after this is all over, the day after? And frankly, I've not heard a single viable idea from anyone here in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or London or Washington about what might happen. Do you have any clue?
So this is the topic, obviously, of discussions around policy circles. I've written about this in the last week, trying to think about, okay, what happens the day after? Now, obviously, what everybody agrees on right now, what everybody is trying to tell the Israelis right now is a military solution does not exist to this conflict. You have tried it time and time again. You go in with all of your military might and you leave, and this happens over and over again because you are not addressing the root cause of the problem, which is the fact that Palestinians are not allowed to have their own state, to live side by side in dignity and peace with the Israelis. And unless you get to that point, unless you get to the point where people are able to live in their own sovereign state, unfortunately, we are going to keep seeing this kind of violence again and again.
Right. And yet Antony Blinken yesterday disinterred the two-state solution like the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, here's something from earlier, from a distant era. I mean, is that even a workable proposition these days?
I mean, to be honest, it becomes less workable by the day. I mean, when you have, the number of civilian casualties in Gaza right now, the number of settlers that are sort of agitating and conducting violent attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank, I mean, the more this goes on, the less viable a two-state solution is, because what's left? What's left for a Palestinian state? Where are the Palestinians that are going to be living in that state if over 9,000 of them have been killed in a month?
Yeah.
So these are the kinds of questions and these are the kinds of conversations that Secretary Blinken, President Biden should be having with the Israelis, is to say, what you're doing right now is ruining prospects for peace, and this hurts you in the long term.
Right. Okay, Jasmine Al Gamal, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Now, the families of some of the 241 people still being held hostage in Gaza have been protesting in Tel Aviv and here in Jerusalem outside the Supreme Court, demanding more action to bring their relatives home. I've met with a number of families throughout this crisis, including Yonatan Silva, son of peace activist Lindsay Silva, who spoke to us just a few days after the Hamas attacks. 4 weeks later, I sat down with him again. Lindsay Silva is one of Israel's most prominent peace campaigners.
I'm sitting in my backyard. My home is 3 minutes from the Gaza Strip.
That proximity was indicative of her politics, but also proved fateful on October the 7th, when she was believed to have been taken hostage by Hamas. Waiting for news, any news, in his flat in Tel Aviv is her son Yonatan.
I believe that if she would have been rescued on the 7th, she would have been very vocal about stopping the war and push for diplomacy.
Even though many members of her community were slaughtered that day.
Yeah, because force only brings more death. And dead babies in Gaza won't heal our dead babies. The only way to move forward is with peace. And the notions we had up until now, that's the proof that they were false.
If and when your mother comes back, when she's free again, there will be Israelis who say to her, all your work, all your good intentions were wasted. What would you say on her behalf in response?
I would say they weren't wasted, they were disregarded. She had the right idea. The fact that we're here is because not enough people listened. From both sides. I see the brutal attack on the 7th and the ability to use such viciousness in a context of so many years of both sides dehumanizing each other. We as a society are able to keep on the occupation, we're able to bomb Gaza like ants. And the other side is able to, Hamas was able to burn people alive, to kill babies, defile bodies. So, that's the escalation of dehumanizing, when you accept the concept that it's acceptable in the world that another human being isn't worth his own life. So it becomes a reality.
So in that hierarchy of evil doing, where does one belong in the other?
I think good and evil in this case isn't between two sides. It's between two powers. The power of life and the power of death. And both powers exist in both sides. So when progressive people, they have it wrong. You have to condemn Hamas's actions on the 7th, and it doesn't mean you're not an ally to the Palestinian people.
Thanks very much. Yonatan Silva speaking to me earlier. That's all from Jerusalem for tonight. Back to Aisha in London. Aisha.
Thanks, Matt. Now, tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters have taken to the streets in London and other cities around the UK for the fourth week in a row. Oxford Circus was brought to a standstill as part of the crowd staged a sit-in. Earlier, the UK's chief rabbi warned against the rise of hateful extremism and claimed the line was in danger of becoming blurred between demonstrators and those who support the brutal terrorism of Hamas. Amelia Jen reports.
Converging on London's Trafalgar Square for the fourth weekend in a row, but for the first since the Home Secretary labelled these protests hate marches. From Paris to Sydney to Buenos Aires, thousands gathered to protest Israel's bombing of Gaza in retaliation to Hamas's October attack.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
In Harrow, a few hundred walked to their Labour MP's office to call for him to support a full ceasefire instead of a humanitarian pause to let aid in.
They're not hate marches, they're peaceful marches. We're asking to stop bombing somewhere. How can that possibly be hate? We're not inciting any hate. We're asking that somewhere be stopped bombing so that children can live.
Completely divisive rhetoric. It's wrong. I mean, look at the crowd. There are plenty of children here. I'm here with my child. It's a peaceful protest. Absolutely not hate marches at all.
This is a conflict felt very deeply. The language around it so often disputed and divisive.
I think now more than ever, the precision of language is absolutely crucial. And although there has been plenty of hate expressed on these marches, I think the characterisation as a hate march, that blanket term, was not one that Jewish News has been using. From the river to the sea specifically, I know that there are people who would question whether that actually means the eradication of Israel. But if you think about it, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, if that is Palestine, then there is no room for the existence of Israel on 1 inch of that land.
Today, the chief rabbi said that while a majority were protesting to support innocent civilians in Gaza, a minority supported Hamas, and that the lines were getting blurred. He said it should be clear that what Hamas meant by resistance jihad or intifada was hateful extremism, but that instead more and more were openly calling for them here and around the world.
Our principles are very, very clear. We've been very, very clear. We call for full support for international law, which makes clear that the targeting and killing of civilians, that the taking of hostages and the imposition of collective punishment on entire populations are illegal.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister called plans to protest on Remembrance Sunday disrespectful, saying it could risk the desecration of the cenotaph. Organisers say they'd never planned to protest in the same location or even at the same time. Tonight, as we go to air, protesters staged a sit-in at a station near Trafalgar Square. With nearly 1,800 officers and reserve deployed in London alone, this is the most policed demonstration yet. The rhetoric getting more impassioned each day the conflict continues.